give our attention now to Rebecca Crick-Stratton and Tad Johnson, who have a lot of material prepared. They're going to get through as much as they can in a half an hour, and then they have one of the breakout sections. So thank you very much, and we'll start with Rebecca Crick-Stratton.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for those of you that stayed to listen to our very brief federal Indian policy and kind of tribal-state relations. I think this information is so important because without understanding the history of these relationships and the tensions of these relationships, it's hard to really move forward in a good way. And I've seen firsthand at Shakopee the difference it makes when we take the time to understand each other's history, understand why we operate the way we do, and to build relationships that we're able to move forward and do some really amazing projects. So we've got this great little book in your packets that we're gonna do kind of just skim over really quick. And on your, one of the sheets in there, I think it's the agenda, there's some QR codes to some links in the back that have some really great resources also. So we are just gonna dive in, and I'm actually gonna hand it over to Tad to dive into some federal Indian law, because that is his specialty.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and I'm honored to be here. In that we were here last time in 2019, both of us. I think we had 2 hours to make the presentation, and while we were sitting there, we changed it about 4 times. So this is my 5-minute presentation. We'll go into it a little depth, but if you, rather than getting the full historical explanation, here's 10 things you need to remember.
You can go ahead and practically eat the microphone. Real close.
Oh, right here. Okay. Here's 10 things you need to know about Indian tribes. And it's in the book, but I'm going to explain them to you first, and then I'll walk through the book really fast. But number 1, Indian tribes retain all sovereignty, all self-governing authorities that haven't been expressly taken away by the Congress. So if you see Indians doing unusual things like hunting, fishing, gathering off-season, or even Indian gaming, those were rights that they retained from before the non-Indian population came in. And number 2, the U.S. has a trust responsibility. It's fiduciary responsibilities to American Indians, their land, their water, their resources. That means that the United States is actually, if you look at a plat map, lands are held by the United States for the benefit of Shakopee or Mille Lacs or whoever. So this is for Mille Lacs County. They have a tremendous fear. They didn't bother to look at the other 580 tribes in the United States or the other 10 in Minnesota. Indian tribes don't necessarily want to and cannot zone, tax, or arrest non-Indians. It's never how many times we've told the Mille Lacs County that. They brought us to court and spent $10 million trying to disestablish our reservation boundaries, which they just lost, by the way. Number 4, being an Indian is a political classification, not a racial classification. And so there can't be a Japanese or Asian American health service or a African American Self-Determination Act. Those are reserved for tribes as nations, as sovereign nations. And so as far back as John Marshall, but as recently as 1974, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that being an American Indian is unlike that. The relationship between the United States and any other group. American Indians are unique in that their relationship with the U.S. started with treaty making. And so since then, all of the tests we've gone through at the Supreme Court has been, is this law rationally related to the treaty relationship between the United States and the tribes? So about 377 treaties were ratified by the Senate. What the Constitution says is they get negotiated by the executive branch, ratified by a 2/3 majority of the law. There were about 600 negotiated, but several of them didn't get ratified. Number 6, there was a 1903 case that said Congress can unilaterally abrogate a treaty. So if the United States wants to just take away tribal land or some sovereign rights, they can do that. That's called plenary power. Number 7, while Congress has plenary power, tribes do still retain their power, and Congress can and has used that power. In 1887, they tried to make the Indians farmers and create allotments for them. That was a failed policy because 2/3 of the land inside reservations in Minnesota under the Nelson Act of 1889, 2/3 of the land went to around here timber companies. So it was a big land grab. And then 53, Congress passed a policy that said, okay, of these 500 plus tribes, we're going to terminate a whole bunch of them. So they basically said, all those promises we made, we're not doing that. They can do that because of plenary power. So the current age we're in right now began in 1970 when Nixon made a message to Congress. And in 75, the Indian Self-Determination Act passed, and in 94, permanent self-governance passed. So self-determination allowed the tribes to break off a piece of all the stuff the Bureau of Indian Affairs or Indian Health Service was doing. And the feds, owing a trust responsibility to the tribes, wrote a check out to the tribes to hire tribal people to do those jobs. It was a capacity building act. By 1994 and later in 2000 with Indian Health Service, they said, the tribe said, what we'd rather do is get the money in a big block grant. We don't want to do a self-determination contract for law enforcement, another one for forestry, another one for social services, whatever. And so they put the money in a big block grant, and the tribes get to prioritize what they do with it. Gaming started with a Minnesota case called Bryan versus Itasca. The issue in that case was a trailer on Leech Lake was being attempted to be regulated and taxed by Itasca County. That went to court. The court ruled for Itasca County. Then it went to the Minnesota State Supreme Court, ruled for Itasca County. Then it got to the U.S. Supreme Court. And Minnesota's argument was, well, Public Law 280, which passed in 1953, which mainly speaks to criminal matters, also applies to civil matters on reservations. And so the Supreme Court said, no, you're wrong, Minnesota. What it means is, yes, criminal jurisdiction is within, under Public Law 280, the tribe. When it comes to matters that regulate things civilly, that's still the province of the tribes. And so they created this dichotomy of criminally prohibited versus civilly regulated by the tribes, criminally prohibited by the state. And then tribes looked at that and said, all right, there are certain things in Minnesota that are legal, but they're regulated by the state. Bingo was the #1 example. So bingo was legal in Minnesota. There were certain pot limits set by the state legislature. Those pot limits didn't apply on reservations, so the great age of big bucks bingo started. And Rebecca's going to talk a little about that. The future of Indian policy in Minnesota, number 10. The future is joint powers agreements. We have them mainly with the police, firefighters, ambulance services, enforcement, basically public safety needs of reservations. And we can't forget the economic power that Indian tribes have in the state. And there's good reasons to do business with them. They're in the top 20 employers in rural Minnesota. 70% of businesses are somehow interrelated with Indian tribes. And so do business with Indian tribes. They're friendly. In your packet, there's a list of, in back of the tribal leader page, where all the tribal leaders' picture are, is a list of books that you have to look at by using your cell phone. But what I highly recommend is a book called The Rights of Indians and Tribes by Stephen Pevar. It's a nice question and answer format book. And I'll turn it back over to Rebecca for the time being. Yes, the book is The Rights of Indians and Tribes. And the author is Pevar, P-E-V-A-R, first name is Stephen. It's an excellent book. We use it in class. So get that one. And then take a look at, right in back of all the tribal leaders' pictures is a whole bunch of reference material listings, and I would look into that too. And I'll be back as soon as Rebecca's done.
So thank you, Tad. I think Tad, he definitely hit like the most important points that come out of the book that you guys have in front of you. I'm just going to start at the beginning and actually talk about some of the things that are more specific to us in Minnesota. And one of those things is the Dakota exile that's highlighted in the book, but really that exile was a product of the Dakota War. President Larson mentioned in his talking points that it is illegal to be Dakota in Minnesota, and that is still true today. Chairman Jensvold also spoke of some of the things that happened to Dakota people that we really don't learn about and we don't acknowledge here in the state of Minnesota. And I think it was mentioned by some of our other Dakota tribal leaders also. But the Dakota War started in August of 1862, and it was the product of a lot of tension. Tribes across the state, not only Dakota, but Ojibwe tribes, had been losing land through treaty dealings. That loss of land prohibited them from being able to take care of themselves, to take care of their families. The commodities, the provisions, the programs and resources that were promised to tribes in these land cessions and treaties that were made were really mismanaged, withheld, used as punishment, given to fur traders. Really it was the way that the agents here in Minnesota dealt with the natives was not in, it was not in good conscience. And there was warnings. I mean, they knew there was a lot of tension here in Minnesota, and I want to say it was January of the year the war broke out, so it must have been January 1862. There was a message back to Washington that really said the system is defective, it needs to be revised, or something's going to happen. Well, that warning was not heeded, and tensions broke out, and it was really a result of Dakota people had no other option. They were dying, and so they rebelled against the Indian agents, and obviously the war broke out. That war didn't last very long. It only lasted about 8 weeks, and the Dakota were defeated by Sibley's army. At the time, the Minnesota governor was Alexander Ramsey, and Ramsey declared that the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. At that point, all the Dakota who were left in Minnesota were rounded up, forced to Fort Snelling, which was a concentration camp. There's no way to sugarcoat it. It was terrible conditions. people were dying left and right from starvation and disease and being exposed to the elements. And then they were taken and marched out of state, loaded on riverboats and taken to reservations outside the state of Minnesota. At that same time, the mass hanging was mentioned today too in comments. As a result of the war, there were over 300 Dakota men that are tried and convicted of various crimes across the state, which led to President Lincoln reviewing those convictions. A large amount of them were commuted, but the ones that weren't led to the largest mass execution in U.S. history, and I believe that is still the largest execution in history. So yeah, the day after Christmas, 38 men were hung in 1863. Currently, the law that's on the books that makes it illegal to be Dakota is an 1863 federal law called the Dakota Expulsion Act. That is still there today. After the Dakota were rounded up and forced out, we didn't think it could get worse, but it did. Governor Ramsey at that time orders, really commissions an army and ends up having over 7,000 people join forces to literally hunt down Dakota people that are left in the state and even outside of the state. He put a bounty on their heads, men, woman, or child, anywhere from $25 to $200. Makes me sick to my stomach to even talk about it, but this is our history. And this is why when we think about, well, one, why are the Dakota reservations in Minnesota so small, and why are there so few of us? This is the history that we need to acknowledge and need to work together to, find a way to move forward in a good way where we work together and not try to separate each other. So why are there still tribes in here? How do we still remain despite the really intense odds? About 150 Dakota were allowed to stay in Minnesota, and those were Dakotas. They called them the friendly Dakota. You'll often hear in some of the history that actually helped Ramsey and Sibley kind of track down Dakota people. So there were a few here, and then over the years, the Dakota people started to come back to their traditional homelands, despite obviously not being welcome in Minnesota. But in 1889, Congress passed legislation allowing the Dakota to establish communities at Lower Sioux, Shakopee, and Prairie Island, and then a few years later, Upper Sioux also. So that is kind of the story of the Dakota exile, very high level, obviously, but why there are so few Dakota nations left here in Minnesota. All of our brothers and sisters kind of scattered to Santee, South Dakota, North Dakota, and even up into Canada.
6 minutes left. All right. I just thank you, Rebecca. Just on this book right here, I wouldn't feel right about not using. If we don't use it, it's a sin because it's good. Yes, thank you. Sorry, my boss. So on page 10, it says Indian nations have always been considered a distinct, independent political community, retaining their original natural rights as the undisputed possessors of the soil, with the very term nation so generally applied to them that it means a people distinct from all others. John Marshall was kind of there had been provisions in the Constitution. One is on the page right before that. Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. And if you think about those three provisions from the Commerce Clause, it underlines three different types of sovereigns that the United States is authorized to regulate. foreign nations, states, and Indian tribes. That and the treaty-making authority are the two places in the Constitution that tribes point to where their sovereignty is underlined. But on page 11 is the Marshall Trilogy. And this is, John Marshall kind of invented federal Indian law in the United States when he was Chief Justice. So Johnson versus McIntosh essentially said that Indian land transactions have to be done by the feds, not the states or people seeking land. It has to go through, in these days, in those days before 1871, all land transactions had to go through treaties. So everything was done first by the Department of War until the Interior Department was created in 1849. The second case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Cherokees took Georgia straight into the Supreme Court because the way the Constitution reads is a foreign nation can go straight to the Supreme Court. Well, Marshall decided you are not foreign nations, you are domestic dependent nations. And the United States is like a guardian and the tribes are like a ward. And that evolved into the legal concept of trusteeship. So as I was saying earlier, the United States is the trustee of tribal lands and the tribes are the beneficiary of that trust. The third case, Worcester versus Georgia, when I'm teaching people who work for the state, is usually the most memorable one. In general, they discovered gold on the Cherokee Nation land in Georgia, and Georgia started passing laws about who can come and go onto the reservation. And so Worcester was a minister, and along with 4 other ministers got arrested for preaching the gospel. And the Cherokees didn't really care. It was like, these guys want to come over and talk. Who cares? But the state of Georgia got all exercised, and they arrested these preachers, threw them in jail. So Worcester got the former Attorney General of the United States to represent him, and Georgia didn't show up. And so John Marshall kind of let Georgia have it. And he said, the laws of Georgia shall have no force on Cherokee lands. Now, if you take out Georgia and stick in Minnesota, you've got the basic underlying law that applies between states and Indian tribes. The one main exception of that was in 1953, during the termination era, which is Public Law 280. It's on page 20. And Public Law 280 said that the criminal laws in 5 states, and they're all listed on the other page, and Alaska got added later, but Minnesota, Wisconsin, Oregon, Nebraska, and California, state criminal law applies on all reservations except Red Lake. Later, in the 1968 Indian Civil Rights Act, they gave tribes the opportunity to opt out of Public Law 280, and that's what my band, the Boys Fort Band, where I'm enrolled, and Kathy Chavers is the chair, did that in 1973, and they're the only tribe in Minnesota to have done that. But so the basic criminal scheme that goes on most of the 500 plus reservations in the U.S. is going on Boys Fort and Red Lake. So misdemeanors go into tribal court. Major crimes get prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney under the 1885 Major Crimes Act. And suddenly there could be special assistant U.S. attorneys. So the Solicitor General at the Mille Lacs Reservation is a SAUSA, as we say, a special assistant U.S. attorney. So he prosecutes a lot of cases in tribal court. He's allowed to do that because Mille Lacs got that jurisdiction back in 2010. So Major Crimes Act cases under the Tribal Law and Order Act, which only White Earth and Mille Lacs have adopted, only those 4 tribes can take cases into federal court. The U.S. Attorney has to be on board, and they don't take all the cases that are eligible on White Earth and Mille Lacs, but they pretty much have to take those cases at Red Lake and Bois Fort. So criminal jurisdiction was recently a huge case in the U.S. Supreme Court. And Justice Gorsuch kind of looked at the state of Oklahoma, and what Oklahoma was saying was, hey, all these reservations were done away with when Oklahoma had its Territorial Act in 1906 and then became a state in 1907. And Gorsuch said, no, that's wrong. That didn't happen. All these reservations that Oklahoma claims that ceased to exist still exist, and so does their criminal jurisdiction. And so that changed the whole ballgame in Oklahoma. That's been, for years, we always said there were several different types of things going on reservations. The three outliers were usually Alaska, California, and Oklahoma. Now Oklahoma is pretty much like any other state with Native Americans in it. California has an odd history because during the termination era, about 106 tribes got terminated. 60 were in California. So while I was working for the Congress between 90 and 95, we were restoring California tribes. So as you can see with Indian policy, it's like a pendulum that swings back and forth. It's kind of like, on the one hand, we're going to make treaties with the tribes. In 1871, they changed their mind and said, we're not going to make treaties with the tribes. And in 1887 and 89 in Minnesota, they said, we're going to divide up the reservations into 40-acre parcels and make the Indians farmers. Well, they didn't. They ended up grabbing all the land. And then 28, a bunch of professors and anthropologists went out and looked at the state of the reservation, found them to be great places of desolation, unemployment, despair, and alcoholism. And in 1934, the pendulum swung the other way, and they said, we're going to have an Indian Reorganization Act where we'll encourage tribes to go under a constitution. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe, which Kathy Chavers is the president of, has a unique structure created by the Interior Department. The 6 other bands, which are also sovereign, are under the umbrella of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, which basically means they do elections together, they hold some land together on the reservation, and they determine enrollments together. Over the years, the bands have achieved more autonomy. So anyway, let me see how we doing here. Do you want to wrap up the last 2 minutes? Yeah. Okay.
All right. So Tad's brilliant with federal Indian law. I was lucky to learn from him at UMD for a couple of years. But I think while it's important to know the history, there's a lot of really good things going on right now. Tribes in Minnesota have come a long way. There's still unmet needs in many of our communities, but still just the ability to work the way we do with our local jurisdictions, with the state. There's a lot of really, really great examples. And I think tribal-state relations is one of those examples. There's been over 5,000 people trained across the state to understand more about tribes, tribal sovereignty, jurisdiction, and how that all interacts with the job you guys do every single day. The Minnesota Indian Affairs Council is a state agency, essentially, that allows for tribal input on the state level and is a really great opportunity for tribes to build relationships and make sure their issues are heard, here in this building. There are law enforcement agreements across the state that benefit tribes and local jurisdictions. At Shakopee, we don't have our own law enforcement. We have what we call conservation officers, but they work very closely with local law enforcement. And we also have joint powers agreements with our fire station. So we respond and provide mutual aid to the cities and counties around us. So another great example, the environmental programs that we have with tribes across the state to ensure water quality is being monitored and that natural resources are being protected. So there's a lot of really great examples of conservation and co-management of lands across the state. I think one of my favorite stories is definitely, of course, a Shakopee story, but we did not always get along with our local jurisdictions. In the 1980s, we had to sue for the right to vote in Prior Lake city elections because the city didn't understand dual citizenship, that, tribal citizens are not only citizens of their tribal nations, but they're citizens of the city they reside in, the county and the state. So there was a lot of tension there. We fought over trust applications because, there was a lack of understanding why we needed to have land in trust, why we needed it to be in our own jurisdiction. Fast forward to just a few years ago, right before COVID, we were able to work with the city of Prior Lake to build a joint water treatment facility that provides water to both of our communities. It saved us both millions of dollars. It prevented, environmental damage by not having to drill so many wells in the aquifer, and it has capacity for expansion because we're both growing communities. Many cities don't work on that level to pair up and drive efficiency to provide those sort of utilities for their members. So thank you all for the work you guys do every single day. It's definitely appreciated. And I think, as we've seen, there's some really great relationships and great things happening across the state that not only benefit tribal nations, but benefit all of Minnesota. So thank you.
Well, thank you to Tad and to Rebecca for being very flexible, and just want to call folks' attention to the breakout sessions. Public safety and law enforcement is in Capitol 120. Cannabis conversation is in Capitol G23. Indian education in Capitol G3. And then there's a switch over at 2 o'clock, and there's 3 more breakout sessions, and you should have all this in your folders. And I would recommend reading that entire booklet that Tad and Rebecca worked so hard on putting together. And again, I'll see you back here in the chamber at 3 o'clock.